All right, so moving right along, we're going to look at Charles Dickens, who here I've called the Victorian Novel Laureate, which is not a real term. There are only poet laureates, but I've done that because he's basically achieved what Tennyson did in poetry, but in fiction. And so he was Victorian England's most beloved and distinctive novelist. What this means is he was immensely popular during his time, easily the most popular Victorian novelist during his time. And some critics, some scholars consider him too standard, too reflective of the values of his day, but there's still just a volume of scholarship on him. And I disagree. I think he's doing incredibly interesting, even dare I say, subversive things, despite his popularity to the masses. And so I think he's not only the most popular Victorian novelist, which is a fact, but the one most well worth studying. He's my favorite novelist. I didn't initially like him because he did seem very reflective rather than subversive of the values of the day. But then in grad school, I was basically forced to read him, and over time, he became my favorite novelist. As I mentioned before, the Victorians wrote the longest novels of any culture, any time period, because of serial publication, because of lending libraries and triple deckers. For the first time in history, there was all this money to be made from novels, and they didn't literally get paid by the word, but they had to get to a certain length to maximize profit. But Dickens is different. You might hear jokes about him getting paid by the word, but those are off base. A lot of his peers did that, but his novels, even though they're long, like his peers, they're interesting all the way through, and every part of them is important. That's part of his brilliance. He's a master plotter, is the word the textbook uses. So to be able to, for 900 pages, um, maintain consistency and interest and engagement, that's an impressive feat that I don't think any other author has accomplished. There's nothing quite like the standard he's able to consistently maintain for 800, 900 pages. And his novels are complex with multiple subplots that all tie together in a beautiful way, but you don't see that till the end. So it may take 400 or 500 pages, the length of a longish regular novel, to even get going and to even really become exciting. But then once you do, the payoff is so great if you can stick it out. So a little bit about him as a person, his background. 2 days before his 12th birthday, he had to begin work in a boot blacking factory and labeled bottles of shoe polish for grossly below what anyone should have been paid for that kind of manual labor. His father did not manage money well and actually went to debtor's prison. Dickens was, I believe, the second oldest child, which is why he had to get this job. But the way debtor's prisons worked at that time, um, the family actually went and lived in the prison with the convict. It's a very interesting setup. His novel Little Dorrit, if you ever read it, it's considered by many to be one of his greatest novels. It it deals with this issue with debtor's prison, and the main family is in debtor's prison with their father for a while, like Dickens' father. This didn't last long, just a few months, but it was very traumatic, and it informs a lot of his fiction. Most of his fiction deals with social injustice, especially against children. And he climbed up the social ladder. He went from this poor background, um, manual labor at 12 years old, to being the most successful novelist of this day. So he climbed the social ladder and was very proud of it. And so this short time in his childhood really informed his adult life. As an adult, he eventually began working as a journalist and published these sketches. The first type of writing he was known for were these short stories, really short pieces, almost more like flash fiction today, where he basically just described a character, often comedically. And these short sketches of comedic characters were incredibly popular, and that's what initially made him famous. Once he moved from the sketches to writing novels, he still took an approach of serial publication, which I talked about in the last lecture, but where, a chapter or several chapters of the novel would be published in a journal once a month or once a week, and so you'd have to come back the next month or next week to keep reading the same novel. So almost, I think, every single one of his novels was published this way, and the majority of the novels of the day, even by other authors, were published that way too. But he really set the trend, beginning in the 1830s and continuing all the way up to 1870 when he died. He was known as a family man and really portrayed domesticity and family values, upheld those in his literary works, but not in his life. He didn't live up to the ideals of his novels. He failed as the husband and the father. The rumors were that his wife's his sister-in-law, to whom he was very close, was the one who really took care of the children and kept the household afloat. But even then, in the 1860s, to the last part of his life, he left his wife, who had bore him 10 children, to live with and be with an actress, Ellen Ternan, who was 27 years younger than him. So Dickens's relationship to his values he portrays in his novels and his reading public that was deeply invested in those values is a complex one, to say the least. There's a really interesting movie called The Invisible Woman, where Ralph Fiennes plays Charles Dickens and Felicity Jones plays Ellen Ternan, and it captures this well. It captures the complexity of Dickens and who he was as an individual really well. He did these reading tours. He was an actor and performed in plays. That's how he met Ellen Ternan. But he also would go around and do these readings from his novels, and they were incredibly popular. He was really good at it, a really good entertainer, and people wanted to see him do these readings. And so he was really like the first celebrity. Byron was like the first rock star, and Dickens was like the first celebrity, because the difference is Dickens had this relationship with his reading public that Byron didn't have, even though Byron was very famous. Byron lived like a rock star, was very popular. Dickens was popular like a celebrity. In film studies, there's a term called a social contract, where celebrities have a relationship with their audience, and the audience has certain expectations based on the roles that have defined their career as an actor. Dickens spent the first 3/4 of his literary career holding up family values the way he does in A Christmas Carol, but he failed in them in the last 10 years of his life. And so he broke his social contract with his reading public. And that was really the first time where there was that kind of relationship. Last point I'll make here is that his writings have a broad and continuous cultural afterlife. Outside of Shakespeare, I don't think there's any author who is represented as much, quoted as much in popular culture. You only need to look at the hundreds of different film and TV versions of A Christmas Carol to see what I mean. So his writings have really endured, would be another way to put that. So I've chosen for our study his short story, The Signal Man, which is a story. He's not known for writing short fiction. He's known for his long novels and then A Christmas Carol. I didn't want to have you read A Christmas Carol. I didn't want you to have to read something that long. But also, Christmas Carol is really emblematic of what he did early in his writing, which is a lot of good social commentary, conscience activating social commentary, a call to action to help people reform the problems of their day. But I think early works like A Christmas Carol lack the complexity of his later works. And even though he failed as a husband and a father, the struggles he had with coming to terms with that decision, and I think the guilt he felt in the last 10 years of his life, make his final novels the most interesting ones. And I think The Signal Man, compared to Christmas Carol, even though it's short, captures the complexities of his final works quite well. Edgar Allan Poe described the short story as this compact piece of literature, and Poe preferred the short story and actually critiqued Dickens for writing things too long, because he thought a short story had to accomplish what a novel accomplished, but in a shorter space. Poe did, and that made it just this interesting explosion. intense explosion of writing. Dickens is not known for his short fiction. He's known for his long novels that irked Poe, but The Signal Man achieves what Poe described. It shows a lot of what Dickens was able to do in his late novels that was so impressive in a very short space. So that's why we're reading it, and that's why we'll look at some of the larger themes from his novels, just like we did with Emily Bronte. Um, so here's some of the important things we're going to explore. There's two themes that are simultaneously working together. The narrator uses the terms reality and unreality. So basically, realism versus the supernatural. This is a very realistic story that's grounded in this study of the signalman and what he does for a living, but at the same time, he's seeing ghosts. And Dickens is using these two things simultaneously together to make his point. So the reality is the social commentary on the working conditions for the signalman. The unreality is the supernatural. Trains are obviously a big part of this. Trains were a big part of the Victorian period. Um, we talked about how significant the introduction of the railroads was to Victorian society. They represent the sweeping changes of modernity. They people were familiar with these rural settings and places, and now you have trains speeding through them, and you have people who, like Dickens, was born in 1812, died in 1870. Railroads were introduced in 1844, so literally smack dab in the middle of his life. Um, so you have people like Dickens who are in their 30s when railroads are introduced, and they see what life was like before and after railroads. I don't think there's any kind of, you might be able to make the argument for the smartphone, but I don't think it's on the same level. I don't think there's any other kind of technological change that a person is able to see that immense level of change in their lifetime. So a little bit of context on trains here. There's the Clayton Tunnel crash of 1861. As the last slide showed, this short story was published in 1866, 4 years before Dickens died. So this is when two trains collided, which is the first of the two accidents the signalman described. So it very well could have been based, that part of the story, on this real crash. And I think even more importantly, Dickens himself was a victim of a rail crash in 1865. It was quite dramatic. He was in a car toward the front of the train because he was rich and famous by this point. This is just a year before he wrote the story, and there was a part of the track that was missing. So the train actually, when it went over it, broke apart and it was dangling. And so he was dangling from these railroad tracks high up in the air. And because he was toward the top, he made it out okay at the beginning, and he actually helped get other survivors out of there. Um, but it haunted him for the last 5 years of his life, and he didn't live much longer after it. It was such a traumatic experience. And in the film, Ellen Ternan and her mom are on the train with them, and they're in a different part because he can't be seen in public with them. And so he's helping survivors, but he can't associate with them. And it really captures, I think, the psychology of the train wreck well. So you should watch that movie, The Invisible Woman. And to just show how prominent the issue of railway travel and railway crashes was during the time, an earlier Dickens novel, well before he was in the accident, Dombey and Son actually depicts a railway crash. So this is central to understanding the story. Here's a picture of the tunnel entrance at Clayton. Is a little bit different than the setting, but I think it gives an idea of the feel for it. The setting of this story is so important, where it's a cutting is where the signalman lives. And so a cutting is where the earth has actually been hollowed out and removed for a road or a train or something to go through. And so this is a very unnatural, isolating setting. This picture, I think, comes somewhat close to it. The first quote I want to look at is actually the description of that setting. Talking about the signalman here. His post was in as solitary and dismal place as ever I saw. On either side a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way only, a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon, the shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to the spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it stuck chill to me as if I had left the natural world. So the setting is unnatural, right? It's this cutting out of the ground where what was natural has been replaced by railroad. Um, it's like below ground, so it isolates the signal man. The sun doesn't even shine there. So that almost gives it an apocalyptic feel. Byron and other poets, there was a time in 1816 or 1818, I think, where there was an eclipse, a long eclipse, and people thought the sun might not come back. Byron composed his poem Darkness, which I assigned for reading but didn't discuss in the lecture on that, and that's an apocalyptic kind of a poem. So I should have mentioned that during the romantic lectures, but here we have a reference to that where the sun doesn't even shine down in this cutting where the signal man lives. So it's about as dismal of a setting as you can imagine. And I think the point here is social commentary. This is the realistic part of the story. So, social commentary on the working conditions. The signal man is a great example of this type of character Dickens always depicts. And so, there's an author named Henry Mayhew who did a study called The London Labor and the London Poor. And Dickens and Mayhew were friends, and Mayhew's study was very influential on Dickens. And Mayhew describes all these types of jobs you'd never heard of. I mean, had you ever heard of a signal man before you read this? But it's this very important job, right? And so, with as we talked about in the previous lecture, with the Industrial Revolution and the sweeping changes of the Victorian period, you basically saw the disappearance of a rural economy and the emergence of modernist capitalism. And so, um, to be able to have a society with all these new technological advances function, you had to have all these odd jobs. And so here you have the signal man. And a lot of these odd characters, odd jobs were based on real things and described in Mayhew's London Labor and the London Poor. And Dickens used that as a source in creating these types of characters. Examples from his novels would be his novel Our Mutual Friend, which is my favorite novel, period. Not just of Dickens, my favorite novel. And I would argue it's not the hardest to read, but it is the most complex novel in the English language. There's these characters called watermen who scour the Thames River in London for dead bodies and find coins or whatever in their pockets, and that's their income. And so that's a type of job. There are also dustmen depicted in that novel, people who just sweep up all the garbage and feces and whatnot on the street into piles. And so these are the kind of jobs that existed only because of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. And so Dickens creates these characters that are based on these real but seemingly odd occupations. And the signal man's a prime example of that. So I really think it's an interesting, complex story to interpret, but I really think one of the central themes ends up being a critique of capitalism. And we'll talk more about that. Here are some more important passages. His pain of mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. So the signal man, I think, is the sympathetic and very appealing character because he's seen as ghost, and each appearance of the ghost has been followed by a horrible accident on the railway. And he was unable to stop it both times. Now the ghost has been appearing a third time. He wants desperately to be able to stop it, and the narrator can see that he's overburdened by this. And so that's incredibly important to understanding the story and understanding the signal man's character. And I think it's a further example of the critique of capitalism. Marx argues that capitalism alienates the worker from his labor. In other words, um, Marx believed we should have a vocation something we truly believe in, we're passionate about what we love doing, like teaching for me, and the kind of labor that's inherently a part of capitalism, say, for instance, being a signalman, is alienating. Um, he doesn't have a passion for his work or his labor um, the way one should. It's a job, not a vocation. And we get this when he talks about how he once studied philosophy, but is now doing the signalman work. And so his inability to save people from railway accidents and the pressure he feels to do that shows how he's alienated from his work. One more quote. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. So I picked this quote because the narrator actually directly uses the terms reality and unreality, which, as I said earlier, are crucial to understanding the story, that these two things are going on. There's the supernatural as well as the story grounded in this reality of the working conditions. And so what he's trying to do here, I think, is encourage the signalman and help him keep his sanity. Whether he's actually seeing ghosts or not, his mind is clearly unraveling from the pressure I discussed in the quote above. And so um, the narrator doesn't really trust him here, or fully believe, I'd be a better way to say that he's actually seen these ghosts, but wants to help him try to pull it together, and he's trying to do that with these words. So those are the key passages to understanding the text. Before we come to my conclusions about it, I want to go through some themes that are present throughout all of Dickens's work. So narrative complexity. Dickens often has these multiple narratives going on at the same time that he brings together. And this story, for how short it is very complex. And so here you have the supernatural and the realistic narratives weaved together. Significant use of physical space. Um, Dickens builds these incredible worlds that are almost like a secondary world, almost like a fantasy world, but they're grounded in reality. But the detail, the depth of detail he puts into creating the setting is one of the most impressive things about his writing. And he creates what I would call like these ecologies, these different communities of characters in London or the surrounding countryside that you have individuals who traverse a certain space and it creates this world in the novel. And so the physical space is very important. You see that here. He does that here with this cutting in which the signalman works, as well as the path the narrator takes, and then back to his hotel, his inn. So there's this little world where the two of them interact. It's very reminiscent of the larger but similar types of worlds Dickens creates. Memorable characters. We already talked about that with the signalman and his occupation. Doubling is a theme that's very important in Dickens. He often has these pairs of characters who are like mirrors or foils to each other. And the Tale of Two Cities, which is probably his most famous novel, you may have read it in high school, deals with this, where the protagonist and another character look almost identical, and that ends up becoming pivotal to the novel's plot. Um, Here you have the narrator who is in many ways a double of the signalman, but at the same time kind of a foil. He represents the reality, while the signalman represents the unreality. Um, Social commentary, we've kind of talked about that with the critique of capitalism. Um, I use the phrase conscience activating call to action to describe Dickens's work. Um, the textbook has probably a more eloquent phrase with the novelist's campaign to bring about the transformation of the individual human heart. Dickens wanted to enact social change, but he approached it by appealing to the individual to change and appealing to the individual through his writing. And if his writing could persuade enough individuals to change, then collectively society would change for the better. And so this was very much a key feature of his early work. And in his later work, he gets more into individual psychology But I think we see that here with the signalman. We're clearly sympathetic to this character, and he's clearly a result. Everything he's going through, as tragic as it is a result of um, what's happened to London through the sweeping changes of the Victorian period. And so this could be a conscience activating type of story. Okay, finally, here are some of the things I pulled from it. So it's a critique of specifically the alienation caused by capitalism. I say alienating form of capitalism because I don't think it's a critique of capitalism in general, as much as it may seem like one. There are a lot of ill effects of the rise of capitalism, which we've discussed in my comments on the London labor and the London poor. But Dickens wasn't opposed to capitalism. If anything, he embraced it because he rose up in social class and became a wealthy celebrity when he worked in a boot blacking factory when he was 12. So he was very much a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, type of person, and wanted that for everyone else. And that was kind of his answer to the ills of society caused by capitalism. But, he didn't see anything wrong with necessarily with a class-based society. So it's a complicated relationship to capitalism. We have a critique of what I would say some of the aspects of capitalism here, specifically the alienation and what it then does to the working class. So I have now three ways in which the story reflects alienation. Repetition is part of like the alienation of capitalism. You're just doing the same thing over and over again and not getting anything out of it. That alienates one from their work. So here you have a pattern that again shows the complexity of the story where the narrator has to go down to enter the cutting to see the signal man. And it's not just simply going down, it's kind of a windy path that he takes from his end, and there's certain steps he learns the second time he can't holler down there before he goes down there. So it's a complex process. He repeats it 3 times. That repetitiveness is one of the ways the laborer is alienated from their work in Marx's critique of capitalism. Physical space shows that he has to go down to enter the physical space. Um, so that's a condescension. Um, it's almost as if the world of the signal man is this bleak apocalyptic world that shows the ravages of time of the Victorian period, and that's the like secondary world Dickens has created in the story. And as the narrator travels into that world, he's like taking us along. He's our conduit to that world, but that world sets the signal man completely apart from the rest of society, so he's isolated and alienated there. Finally, riding on trains is another form of alienation. There's scholarship on this, but trains were dangerous, new and dangerous technology, and people viewed them that way and were afraid of them, but rode them at the same time. And so, riding on a train, you basically put yourself into a position where you are no longer in control of your own survival. And that was a very, very alienating, scaring thing to people. And the single man represents a character here who's trying to mediate that, but failing at it. Finally, to come back to my point that Dickens actually embraced capitalism while critiquing certain aspects of it, um, I think more generally, you can extrapolate out here that this story is not just a critique of capitalism, but a critique of the progress. I should have put progress in quotes of the Victorian period, that things have changed too fast for everyone's own good. And trains, which move very fast and are modern technological achievement, represent that. And so, I think more broadly, he's really, I mean, you can't really critique that because as we saw with Sir Walter Scott, change is inevitable. But I think he's doing something similar to Sir Walter Scott here, where he's trying to help his readers cope with that change. And so he's perhaps mourning a lost way of life. We don't really see what the earlier way of life was like we do in Scott. But we know that what the signal man is living in is not good, but we also know it's modern. Um, and um, it's an apocalyptic setting. You could almost say post-apocalyptic after the Industrial Revolution here. And so that's Dickens's way of, I think, assuaging his readers like Scott did. Finally, this story is so complex and so interesting. I'm going to do something I don't usually do and leave you with some unanswered questions. These are things you could pursue in your papers or your threads or thesis. Did the signal man really see ghosts? Um, maybe, maybe not. That's the unreality versus reality. Why was he unable to avoid being killed by the train? The narrator consistently points out how good he is at his job, and then his coworkers say when the narrator shows up and finds his corpse that no man in England knew his work better. And the conductor, the engineer, was signaling to him, so he should have been able to escape this fate, but didn't. Why? Did he kill himself? Was it a self-sacrificial thing? If he was the accident, would it avoid someone else being the accident, since every single time the ghost appears, there's an accident? I don't know. I'd love to hear your answers. What's really interesting is the novel opens with this phrase, "Hello, below there," and the signalman's freaked out, even though it's the narrator saying that, because that's what the ghosts have said, and then that's what the conductor says or the engineer, the person driving the train, says at the end. So are all three the same individual? Um, did he really see the ghost? What's going on? I think there's an intentional ambiguity here. There's a phrase denouement, which means how a story ends, and it's either open or closed denouement. Closed denouement, it's all wrapped up nicely. Open, there's some ambiguity. I think this is open denouement. We don't know the answers to these questions, and I don't know if Dickens does, or if he did, he maybe didn't want to tell us. I think thinking about these questions helps us interpret the story, and Dickens is forcing us to do some things here, which is very much his style, a complex narrative that calls his readers to action.